This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
I was at the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks ago. I met with 7 European foreign ministers from big countries and small countries. This was my main mission, was to advocate for the confiscation of the $300 billion. And I was preaching to the choir. There was no disagreement in any conversation I had that this was the right thing to do. The reason why it hasn't happened is because up until then, Germany had a chancellor who was one step forward, one step back in terms of Russia. And it's not all hard to do. One can do this. I mean, when COVID started, within like a month, there were vaccine protocols and there was, hundreds of billions of dollars of new loans. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that can be done very quickly if there's a necessity, and there's now a necessity.
I'm Jason Pack, and you're listening to Disorder, the show where we say Slava Ukraini, and we protest the fact that we don't want our president to play a Russian agent on television. We want a world of rules-based order where if you're fighting to defend your own territory and if you're the victim, then right will triumph over might. But apparently, we realize that we're in a world where many people no longer care about the rules-based order, about basic civility, about shared values and culture. And that's how Vance and Trump can get away with their cosplay act of being dictators and of trying to be tough guys. Because the people who voted for them and many throughout the world are like, great, we don't care about the rules that are being trampled. If somehow this is going to save a few American taxpayer dollars, then it's okay. But what shocks me is that some people think that Trump is going to be able to make peace. They think that this kind of approach of bullying the Ukrainians is going to result in a ceasefire. Putin can't be trusted. As Zelenskyy has said, what did he do with previous ceasefires? He violated them. What did he do in 2008? He invaded Georgia. And in 2014, he violated the Budapest Memorandum. And he then violated future ceasefires. What person in their right mind would think that without the use of hard power, giving the Ukrainians the ability to punch back, Putin can be kept in check? It's absolute insanity. I don't even think that Trump believes his answer. Oh, they violated the agreements before because it was Biden, and now Putin respects me and would never violate an agreement with me. What insanity. To quote a Turkish proverb, when a clown moves into a palace, he doesn't become a king. The palace becomes a circus. And we are now living in that disordered circus. It's time to go now to a previously recorded interview with Bill Browder, where we talked about the minerals deal that Zelenskyy was coming to Washington ostensibly to sign. But it appears like it was a media carrot, that deal, to bring him to Washington, because Zelenskyy knew that, what do you know, Ukraine doesn't have much minerals, but if I can try to give away some minerals in a way that will get the U.S. on side and allow us all to save face, that's a fine way to save face. So we're going to cut to the Bill Browder interview because now is a time for moral clarity, and Browder brings that moral clarity. But it's critical to keep in mind that it was recorded on Feb 26. Therefore, back to our regular scheduled programming. So I am greatly honored to be joined by our returning champion, Sir Bill Browder.
Great to be here.
Since his 2016 campaign, Trump signaled his striking difference with all previous Republican candidates to be U.S. president in terms of his view on Russia. He's been amazingly open about his closeness to Putin. During the 2016 campaign, he asked Russia to hack Hillary's emails. On the debate stage, he said that China and not Russia was a threat, that we should work with Russia against China. Then, during his first term as president, he had the cringeworthy Helsinki summit, and he constantly threatened denying Ukraine weapons to get dirt on Hunter Biden. While he was out of office and the full-scale invasion started in February 2022, he called Putin's actions genius. And then the 2024 campaign for president, he attacked Zelenskyy and said he could end the war in 24 hours. So we all knew that a second Trump term would be some kind of bizarre appeasement or repivoting towards Russia. Bill, can anyone in the States or in Europe be genuinely surprised where we find ourselves? Has anything happened that couldn't have been expected?
Yeah, everything, actually. You know, you went through this really very complete resume of issues and actions which look pretty unpleasant from the outside. But the reality was that during Trump's first term, not that much happened that was very helpful to Putin. We were in a world where, you know, he would say these things, but at the end of the day, Putin carried on being isolated in the way he was isolated. The sanctions programs against Russia still existed. And then most importantly, the U.S. administration, the military, the Treasury, the State Department, all treated Russia like, you know, the arm's length adversary enemy that it was. We're now in a totally new world order. We're in a world order where even after Putin has invaded Ukraine, killed off tens, if not hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, killed off hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, leveled entire cities, been indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Even after all of that, Trump sends his Secretary of State to Saudi Arabia to meet with Sergei Lavrov, in which they then can talk about resetting relations, talk about Russia joining the G7, talk about sanctions being lifted, talk about restaffing their respective embassies, talk about business opportunities for American companies. And this is a totally different world. And of course, even worse than that, was voting along with Russia at the United Nations. And then on top of that, this is not just Trump, but everybody who works for him. So they have these guys, his national security advisor and his special envoy for projects on television, not wanting to admit that Russia was the aggressor. All these things so far are words. They're not, the consequences haven't happened yet. But my fear is that it's going to happen, and it's a lot of other stuff is going to happen, and all of a sudden Russia is going to become sort of allied with the United States. If that happens, God help us.
You've sketched out very clearly the differences in the second Trump term towards Russia. And yes, in the first Trump term, I agree with you completely. He was constrained by the quote-unquote establishment, whether it was McMaster or Milley or establishment Republicans in Congress, and they have all been eliminated or made to kiss the ring. What I would like to push back on slightly is anyone who didn't see this coming, though, had a failure of imagination, because he told us, I'm getting rid of all those checks and balances. The second Trump term will be my actual impulses without any filter, and my impulses are to appease my buddy, Vlad. So is there anything that's happened that couldn't have been predicted?
Well, I guess I don't think I could have predicted that America would switch sides and go over to the dark side. I mean,
I predicted it on this podcast. So in the intervening episodes between speaking to you in episode 26 and now, I said that a core component of the second Trump term will be the purging of the traditional neocon wing of the Republican foreign policy establishment, which is anti-Russia, and its replacement by a new pro-neo-populist wing for whom appeasing Russia will be the primary litmus test to get any position in the administration.
Well, you were a good predictor. I looked at it and I said there are two sides to this whole thing. There's the Tucker Carlson, David Sachs, Donald Trump Jr. side, who all hate Ukraine and love Putin. And then there is the Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and General Kellogg side of people who have seen the dangers of Russia. And I didn't know which side would win. And interestingly, in the first few days after Trump was inaugurated, he had some pretty tough words for Putin. He actually came out and said tariffs, taxes, and sanctions if Putin doesn't come to the table and end the war. And I thought, oh, wow, the Tucker Carlson must be really angry and Marco Rubio must be really happy right now. And I was sort of hanging on that as like, maybe this is a change in direction, unexpected, but and then it all came undone in a dramatic way.
That was a little tease just to start things up, to mix it up. I want to ask about the role of Kellogg. We hear that he's being slightly marginalized, that the administration is understanding that his daughter does humanitarian work in Ukraine, and that both Kellogg and Rubio and any real State Department experts are essentially sidelined. What do you know about this? What are your thoughts that Trump's Middle East envoy is the one who's going to Moscow now, and that there's a lot of shadow policymakers, and that the quote-unquote people who actually have this as their file aren't the ones doing the diplomacy?
Yeah. Well, so this General Kellogg guy, if you read his writings and so on, I might not have agreed with every word he said, but more or less, he was in the sort of normal frame of mind about, what are the issues and what do we have to deal with and so on and so forth. And he was running around both before the inauguration and after the inauguration, meeting with European allies, meeting with Ukrainians, telling everybody it's going to be there's a new sheriff in town, but we're going to look after everyone's interests and this is going to be okay. And everybody was reassured. And I can remember, seeing various positive articles in the FT about transatlantic relationships and so on and so forth. But what we know about Trump, part of this is why he's so successful, is that he doesn't really care about titles and institutions and so on and so forth. He's sort of a freestyle guy. And so his special envoy for Ukraine, that wasn't really working for him. And then he has this other special envoy, this Steve Witkoff, who is a real estate developer in Miami, I believe, who somehow has just gotten Trump's trust. And somehow he was able to connect to a guy named Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Investment Fund. And Kirill Dmitriev, I knew him from 1,000 years ago. He's kind of like this Harvard-educated guy who went to McKinsey, and I can't remember. He speaks like we do, and so you'd think he's like one of us. And I'm pretty sure he was friends with Jared Kushner or something like that. Anyways, he got hold of him, and through that connection, Putin was able to offer Mark Fogel, who is a teacher at the American School of Moscow, who had a back injury and was using medical marijuana to treat his back injury. And they sentenced him to 10 years. They found the marijuana on him, and they sentenced him to 10 years in jail. And Biden had forgotten about him during the previous prisoner swap. And so Putin offered him up in exchange for a hacker who was in jail in America. And so Witkoff freelanced, went out there and got Fogel in exchange for this hacker. And all of a sudden, he's a guy who gets stuff done. And when he came back, he gave this interview, and I was watching it, and I was shaking my head talking so glowingly about what a great guy Putin was, and he spent 3.5 hours with him, and he really wants to thank Putin for his leadership. I mean, Putin was the guy who took Mark Fogel hostage. It's like thanking Osama bin Laden for his leadership. But he produced. He was a producer. In Trump's world, he likes a producer, a guy who gets stuff done. And so all of a sudden, here he is sitting at the top table.
You point out that they operate in a stream of consciousness world, Bill. And in that stream of consciousness world, one thing leads to another, and this deep transactionalism that you mention is something that is embraced rather than used in service of principles or institutions. The transactionalism is the principle itself. But you also pointed out another philosophical thing, which is Trump himself loves flattery, but he may understand deeply that his interlocutors love flattery and appearances as well. In other words, when he goes and he meets with Kim Jong-un, he knows to say, "You're the greatest dictator in all of Asia. You're Rocket Man. You're great." And he knows to have his people say, "Hey, the Ukrainians started the war. Putin didn't do anything. He's a genius." Is this just appeasement and giving away America for nothing? Or is there a possibility that this attempt to restart relations with Russia is for some larger transactional, economic, or strategic purpose with Russia?
Well, I mean, I think that's very generous to Trump. And the most generous argument to him is that he hasn't actually sold America to the dictators as it appears at the United Nations vote, that he's got a much bigger geostrategic agenda, which is to break the Russian relationship with China and bring Russia together with America, and together they will contain China, which is ultimately our biggest adversary, and so on and so forth. That's a very generous view. The other way to look at it is this is just tic-tac-toe. He's sort of playing for what's going on this week. There's one possible saving grace in everything that's happened, though, I should point out, and I don't want to be too optimistic about it, but Trump has defaulted and swindled everybody he's ever done business with. Been bankrupted a number of times, borrowed money, lies, etc. And so whatever Putin thinks he's going to get from Trump, he may not get that either. I mean, these are all words at the moment. Simple words. I was at the Munich Security Conference. I met with a lot of different members of Congress, both from the Republican side and the Democrat side. And what I can tell you is that there's no disagreement whatsoever in Congress on what needs to be done with Ukraine and what needs to be done with Putin. Everybody knows that Putin's the bad guy, that Ukraine and Zelenskyy are the good guys, that they're defending themselves, they're a democracy, Putin's a dictatorship. And a lot of these people have very close relationships with Trump. Lindsey Graham is a confidant of Trump. You have John Cornyn, you have Representative Joe Wilson. Joe Wilson has just proposed putting Trump's face on the $250 bill. And Joe Wilson is just absolutely frothing at the mouth in favor of Ukraine and against Putin. So the story about Trump is that the policy is whoever was in his office last. And so I'm not saying that things are going to turn out okay. I'm probably the most demoralized of all people because I've been fighting Putin for 15 years and it looks like all of my work is about to be undone. But at the same time, it's also uncertain that I think we have to could play in any direction. It's totally volatile. It's unpredictable.
I want to recap some really interesting points that you've raised, Bill, for the listeners. One is that Trump's sheer incompetence may save us from the horrific outcome that we all dread because he can't deliver the deal to Putin on a platter, or he hasn't thought through all of the components. So that's one point. Another potential point is that he is an agent of disorder rather than being an agent of the Kremlin, and that he has danced around this notion either to get into power or to get certain things from the Russians or to have some of the Tucker Carlson wing of the party help him out and have Orban root for him. And it's not like he actually is looking forward to selling the country to Moscow, right? I would argue what he cares about is the tic-tac-toe game of what disorder can I do this week that I can make it seem like I am a stable genius who won the news cycle. So now I want to pivot to the question of the quote-unquote Ukraine mineral deal, because I'm of the belief that it's all completely bogus. No one is going to make any money on this. It is a joke. But what it does geniusly is it captures a news cycle. It disorders us from actual strategic priorities. So to introduce to the listeners, I am going to read from an FT article dated February 25th titled Ukraine Agrees Mineral Deal with U.S. We're going to put this link in the show notes. Quote, the final version of the agreement dated Feb 24 and seen by the FT would establish a fund into which Ukraine would contribute 50% of proceeds from the future monetization of state-owned mineral resources, including oil and gas and associated logistics. The fund would also be able to invest in projects in Ukraine. Ukraine has large underground deposits worth up to 11.5 trillion of critical minerals, including ... blah, 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 essential for an array of industries from defense to electrical vehicles. The agreement excludes mineral resources that already contribute to Ukrainian government coffers, meaning it would not cover the existing activities of Naftigas or Ukranaft. Now, I have heard a range of geologists explain that Ukraine's rare earths are not actually that impressive. The infrastructure doesn't exist to exploit them. And I understand that this deal, which lacks security guarantees on the one side and lacks specific monetization guarantees on the other, means it's just for PR. What am I missing here?
You're not missing anything. It's a nothing burger, using the language of Donald Trump. So Ukraine is promising some potential future revenues on something that basically doesn't exist. And America is offering vague security guarantees on a security that's not going to be provided. This is a way for everybody to save face. So Trump had a temper tantrum. He got mad at Zelenskyy. And Zelenskyy had to find a way to make Trump look good, and he did. And what's interesting is this whole visit of Scott Bessent at the very beginning. So Scott Bessent showed up with a term sheet saying, we want $500 billion. We want you to hand over all resources of your country, ports, electricity, gas, oil, and rare earth minerals into perpetuity until you pay back this $500 billion debt. I wasn't there, of course, but I've read accounts where he got so angry with him that in the photo op afterwards, Scott Bessent was shaking. And I would imagine that Zelenskyy is a pretty formidable character. I mean, he's a guy who's been, stood up to Putin in 20 assassination attempts. And, he's the guy who said, I don't want a helicopter, I want ammunition on the first day of Russia's invasion. Scott Bessent, is an economist or a hedge fund guy. I'm sure he's never seen anything like that before.
Well said. So I think that the deal is a nothing burger, but should we not give the administration some credit that you and I would not conceive of a way to manipulate the global media narrative so successfully? In preparation for the interview today, I turned on CNBC, BBC, Bloomberg News, and Sky News, all of which in a 5-minute period were covering the minerals deal between Ukraine and the U.S. with the same map of where is the lithium, where are the rare earths, where is the titanium. And none of the analysts said, no one is going to make any money from this deal. It's not going to be what governs the détente. It was covered as straight news. Is there not something genius to the way that tic-tac-toe is being played by the administration?
Yeah, Trump is the best tic-tac-toe player in the world. He is a political genius. I mean, eating cats and dogs, everyone thought that was a bad idea, advised him against it, but, kept him front of the news cycle for 2 weeks. Everyone forgot about who is this person he's running against him. We didn't even remember who she was, because cats and dogs every day, there he was. He's a political genius. I mean, the thing about this development is what happens after that? Does Putin's recalcitrance then become the focus of his attention? Maybe all of a sudden he's no longer, Putin's friend. I mean, we just don't know. The whole thing is just so volatile. I'd like to think that he's going to play all different sides, and maybe this is his negotiating genius. But what I find so distasteful and bothersome is watching these grown men refuse to answer the question on interviews and television and in hearings, who started the war. That just makes me sick to the stomach.
I like how you've done a job here separating the ridiculous from the morally reprehensible for the listeners. And I want to sum that up again, which is that there may be some ridiculosity of this media tic-tac-toe talking about these rare earths and manipulating the coverage of CNBC. But we, in the Disorder program, we care about the morality for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who's lost their homes and have been killed and casualties, and the implications for global order of the territorial integrity norm and the Budapest Memorandum being stamped upon. So if we pivot away from the ridiculous and more to the tragedy of our current moment, Trump has taken things in this direction. I kind of knew it was happening. Others might have been more surprised. Give us some moral clarity. Where are we now? What does this mean for the international order and for innocent lives, not only in Eastern Europe, but elsewhere?
It's really important for everybody to understand that while Trump is the president of the United States and he controls the apparatus of government of the United States, the view that he's expressed, that Ukraine started the war, that Zelenskyy is a dictator, all this terrible stuff, is a view that's not shared by anybody other than him and the people he instructs to have that view. The American people don't have that view.
I don't believe the Russian people even have that view.
6% of Americans support Putin. 94% of Americans either don't care or hate his guts. As I mentioned before, every member of Congress thinks that Putin is a monster, other than Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and a few other people who don't deserve the, even time to be mentioned. And then of course, Tucker Carlson. And so Trump can try to the extent that he's going to carry on with this, which there's no reason to believe that he's not, he is actually a leader, and not necessarily a leader that we would like in these circumstances, but he is a leader, and leaders can change people's opinions. And so he certainly can change the opinion of the people who work for him because they'll do whatever they're told. But the one thing that he can't do, and we're seeing this really play out in real time, is he can't convince everybody else in the world. And there's a lot of other players in this game. Most importantly, the Europeans. And I was very heartened to watch Emmanuel Macron, who's a genius, smiling, putting his hand on Trump's hand and saying, no, that's not actually true. Putin is the aggressor, etc. And I've met with many of these people, and there's absolutely all this bullying, Trump's bullying to change opinion. He can do that to a certain extent among certain people in America, but it doesn't work anywhere else. And in fact, it just has the exact opposite effect. So by doing this, he has so enraged European leaders that Putin may actually be unhappy about the ultimate result of this thing, because all of a sudden the Europeans, who are all sort of examining their navals, going in different directions, arguing among themselves, they've all grown a backbone.
From your mouth to God's ears, Bill, I hope that the stick of disorder which Trump has dangled in front of Europe has actually served as a carrot to unify the quote-unquote slight differences between Germany and Italy and Poland and the UK to create coherent defense policy and solve the coordination problem. After the break, we will return with Sir Bill Browder as he and I order the disorder and particularly delve into the questions of what can the Europeans do? What can the UK do to help Ukraine to deter Russia and to unify themselves in the face of the threat from Trump?
Take me out to the ball game.
What are you doing?
Did you know DirecTV has the most MLB games?
So, you're singing.
Yeah, they put your favorite teams front and center right when you turn it on. Buy me some cold cuts and flapjacks.
Those aren't even the words.
I'm allergic to peanuts.
Stream DirecTV, home of the most MLB games. Visit DirecTV.com. Claim based on total games offered on national and regional sports networks. RSNs available with choice package or higher. Availability of RSNs varies by zip code and package.
Support comes from ServiceNow. We're for people doing the creative work they actually want to do. That's why this ad was written and read by a real person and not AI. You know what people don't want to do? Boring, busy work. Now with AI agents built into the ServiceNow platform, you can automate millions of repetitive tasks in every corner of your business, IT, HR, and more, so your people can focus on the work that they want to do. That's putting AI agents to work for people. It's your turn. Visit servicenow.com.
This episode is brought to you by Honda. Introducing the all-new, all-terrain Honda Passport Trail Sport, the most off-road capable Honda Passport Honda has ever dreamt up. The Passport features increased ground clearance, roof rails on all trims, and available specially developed all-terrain tires. And you'll stay comfortable with tri-zone climate control and available features like heated and ventilated front seats and a panoramic moonroof. Learn more at honda.com/passport.
We're back. I want to learn from Sir Bill what the Europeans can do to order the disorder. Given that Trump is president, both you and I have become, in your case, or are becoming, in my case, British. What can the UK in specific do to order the disorder in Eastern Europe?
Well, there's one very important thing, which is money. At the end of the day, Ukraine's ability to defend themselves against Putin's war of aggression requires resources, military resources. Ukraine is a poor country. Russia is a rich country. The only way that Ukraine can successfully ward off the invader is to have weapons to fight back. And Ukraine has done an unbelievable, remarkable, historic job of fighting off the Russians. They were supposed to win in 3 days. It's now 3 years, and they're nowhere near any definition of winning. The sacrifices that Putin has had to make for very small territorial gains are unimaginable. The leverage that Trump has in forcing a bad deal on the Ukrainians is to basically say that we're not going to give you any money anymore, and therefore when your equipment runs out, when your ammunition runs out, which it will do in the not too distant future, you're going to lose, and so you might as well give in now. That's the basic pitch to the Ukrainians. And so the way to avoid that is for some other source of funding. And so how did the funding work? Europe was responsible for about 60% of the aid to Ukraine. America was responsible for 40%. So the 40% will disappear.
It may not, but it might.
Well, that's the threat. That's the leverage that Trump has. And so then the question is, where can that money come from? And as a dweller in the UK, you probably read the news as much as I do, and the government is cutting off heating fuel subsidies for destitute pensioners in the winter. It's going to be hard to do that and, double down on aid for Ukraine. And so I have a very simple solution. It's not my solution. I think there's a lot of other smart people looking at this, which is that when the war started here in the UK and in the EU and US, Canada, etc., froze $300 billion of Russia's sovereign central bank reserves. This is the money that belonged to the Russian government. They kept it in the central bank. They kept it in foreign exchange, and the money is now frozen. Since the war started, I think the estimates are that the Russian damage to Ukraine is greater than $1 trillion. And so we're in a situation where Russia clearly owes that money to Ukraine. We have it in our custody. And the way that we can protect Ukraine now, in terms of the potential cutoff of U.S. military aid, is to confiscate that money and use it as a Ukraine defense fund.
We spoke about this when you were last on Disorder, the idea of creating Navalny Acts. It would have been genius to do then, right in the wake of his murder, the seizing of those assets and giving them to Ukraine for its defense and reconstruction. Obviously, the mega orderers on the program love the idea of freezing those assets, expropriating them, having the Navalny Acts. I was heartened to hear Sir Ed Davey, leader of the Lib Dems, speak this morning in Westminster, saying that Russian assets held in the UK could be seized to fund even increases in defense spending, like the movement from 2.3 to 2.5% that Keir Starmer has announced. Now, what I want to ask you is, how likely is it that the UK would do this if all the other EU countries or other allies are not doing it?
It's completely unlikely. So the only way to do this is if everybody does it together, which creates an issue because Trump is not going to do it. However, we're in a situation now with the Europeans where it's really, a desperate moment. If Ukraine falls, then the next thing that happens is we end up with 15 or 20 million Ukrainian refugees fleeing Ukraine and fanning out across Europe. If Ukraine falls, Putin will then make a move on Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or Poland. If he does that, and there's a very high chance that Trump won't honor Article 5 of NATO, and therefore it's going to be a European war or a European capitulation. And so it's a very unattractive thing to confiscate money of another country. But it's also a very unattractive thing for another country to invade a sovereign state and cause all this damage. And I would argue that whatever the worries are, and I don't believe that they're as big as people make them out to be about disrupting the global financial system by doing this, I think the worries about 20 million refugees and having to jack up defense spending to 7% of GDP or 10% because we're at war with Russia, trump that, no pun intended. And I think that the arguments have always been these technical, legal arguments. How do you thread this needle? And I think that, it's easy for politicians to be roadblocked by bureaucracy and lawyers throwing up obstacles. But at the end of the day, this is an issue of political will, not legal will. And if the politicians understood the risk reward of not taking this money, I think that we would have taken this money yesterday and we should absolutely take it tomorrow.
You have been more in the room where things happen, not only at the Munich Security Conference, but speaking to various European foreign ministers and other movers and shakers than I have been able to. I want to learn from you, what would it actually take? Because we know that the Brits aren't going to do this alone. And we know that the Belgians, even though they have Euroclear in their territory, they're not going to act if the EU and Ursula von der Leyen are not. So this is what we call on the Disorder program a coordination complexity. And that we're in this global enduring disorder because although there may be 7 well-intentioned actors, they just can't coordinate together. So what would it take to get the different pieces of the puzzle to be able to take this step?
I was at the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks ago. I met with 7 European foreign ministers from big countries and small countries. This was my main mission, was to advocate for the confiscation of the $300 billion. And I was preaching to the choir. There was no disagreement in any conversation I had that this was the right thing to do. The reason why it hasn't happened is because up until then, Germany had a chancellor who was one step forward, one step back in terms of Russia. This was Olaf Scholz, social democrat, comes from the same party that Gerhard Schroeder came from, the man who's currently was until recently on the board of Gazprom and Rosneft and all sorts of other Russian companies moments after he left the chancellery. Olaf Scholz has always wanted to show the Russians that, yeah, he was going along with the European consensus, but not really. And then when the war ends, Germany would get special favors from Russia and so on and so forth. I think that was his position. You had Christine Lagarde, who's head of the European Central Bank, who is somehow convinced Macron that if we do this, the Saudis would all abandon the euro and dump all of their European government bonds, and that would create an economic crisis, which, again, I think is a very stupid argument. And of course, the Belgians are the only people actually with the real argument. The Belgians have the money. It would be their legal liability if they confiscated it. They need a joint and several agreement among all the members of the European Union that if there's any trouble, that they're all going to be standing with each other legally to defend any challenge that the Russians make in the future. And of course they're going to make a challenge, but the Belgians can't be left on their own to be the target of all Russian legal and other types of aggression. It needs to be a European Union decision. And it's not all hard to do. One can do this. I mean, when COVID started, within like a month, there were vaccine protocols and there was, hundreds of billions of dollars of new loans. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that can be done very quickly if there's a necessity, and there's now a necessity. And so I heard Macron at the White House still saying that the money is going to be used for the future, in a negotiation. But that could change, and that could change very quickly when the rubber meets the road. Europe has to come up with the money for Ukraine, and where are they going to get it from?
It's a question of political will, as you've said. Let's progress to the lightning round. Do you think any kind of sanctions relief for Russia is warranted without Moscow agreeing to pay war reparations to Ukraine?
Of course not. I mean, it's not only war reparations, there has to be prosecutions of the people involved. You can't have this injustice sort of festering.
100%. Do you think that the Trump administration is offering sanctions relief? And if so, what are they trying to get out of that?
Well, I think that this meeting in Riyadh wasn't even about the war. I think the meeting in Riyadh was simply about resetting relations between Trump and Putin. It was to schedule a meeting. The Americans was basically saying, here's a couple gifts. Can we just get along with you now? It has nothing to do with the war. And I think that there will be sanctions relief without any type of, I think they may do sanctions relief without even a ceasefire, let alone, an end to the war.
Yeah, Trump is really great at giving away his negotiating leverage before the negotiations start. He did that in North Korea, and I wouldn't be surprised he's doing that with Russia now. And what will this do in terms of the military dynamics in Donbass?
Well, at the end of the day, if there is sanctions relief, depending on what that sanctions relief is and how broad it is, it will give Putin more economic power to carry on doing everything that he's doing. Putin, he hasn't been in any way chastened by this situation. If anything, he's been rewarded. His only problem right now is lack of manpower because he's burned through all the convicts, he's burned through all the conscripts, he's burned through all the people who he paid $4,000, now he's got to pay $40,000 sign-on bonus, and he's burned through all the North Koreans. And so he's got a manpower problem, and he's got a money problem because interest rates are at 23%. The economy is in a bad state. They've had to reallocate all money away from social spending, healthcare, etc., towards military. And you can't do that forever without people getting pretty grumpy. And so if he gets sanctions relief, he gets more money. He can spend that money on more weapons. He can spend that money on people to go and fight in the war and attack Ukraine, and it would be terrible.
Yeah, appeasement is obviously the wrong answer, and I believe the argument that Russia was truly on its knees and that the knockout blow could have been delivered in 25 or 26 with upping of Western defense support to Ukraine. Continuing the lightning round, what international institution could be created by non-neo-populist democracies to deal with the rise of the AfD, Trump, Wilders, Le Pen in their erstwhile allies?
I think that the main institutions that should be set up are the agencies that look for foreign influence. Here in the UK, we don't have what they had in America called the Foreign Agent Registration Act. You can be a highly influential British person, you could be paid by Russia or Iran or whatever, and you don't have to declare that to anybody, and then you can go run around Parliament lobbying interests. The fact that Elon Musk was threatening to come here and spend £100 million on the reform, how can that be? He's a South African-born Canadian. Just because he has a company here that he can pay £100 million? I mean, that's just absurd and insane. As of right now, there's no system to protect against that. I mean, democracy is democracy, and if there's people are genuinely Nazis here, then so be it. But if you have a bunch of small group of Nazis from somewhere else spending their money and manipulating the system, that has to be stopped.
This is exactly what we discussed with Peter Gagan and Tom Burgess, the UK's, shall we say, permissive money environment, the lack of the FARA registration, and the dark money, which even small amounts of dark money can have an oversized impact in the UK. So what I want to ask you then is, has this movement of hedge funders and Bitcoiners to Trump, who didn't necessarily support him in 2016, meant the rise of a kind of libertarian oligarchic class who is okay with this? And how would you see those shifts among these uber elites who were traditionally either mainstream conservatives or on the center left?
Well, I mean, basically, you have so many people that are one-issue voters. I mean, I'm a one-issue voter. My issue is Putin. And these people are one-issue voters, which is who's going to make them more money in Bitcoin, or who's going to be deregulating and not giving tech companies a hard time. And, Biden didn't do a great job by he had this Federal Trade Commission that was basically stopping every merger that was ever happening. And so, in a certain way, he delivered a lot of these people into Trump's hands. And so there's not like the good and bad here. Everyone was bad. But now we have all these people with a lot of money, in their one issue. They could care less about what's going on with Ukraine. They could care less.
I think that's exactly right. We've seen this rise of the one-issue Bitcoin plutocrat voter. And next week, we're going to be joined by George Monbiot, the Guardian columnist, to speak about the kind of neoliberalism and market capture that has led to this position. Okay, I have one more question for you, Bill. Why can't Europe just mobilize its production of defense articles and get an integrated European army and be like, the barbarians are at the gates. We finally see the Visigoths. They're coming. Let's actually get this legion together. What's it going to take, Bill?
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly what it's going to take is a speech that took place on Saturday at the Munich Security Conference of J.D. Vance, telling everybody that you're the enemy. That's what it took. And for everybody who thinks that Europe is so feeble and so unable to do this, if you take the UK economy, combine it with the European Union economy, it's almost the same as the US economy, size-wise. There's more people in Europe. And by the way, in Europe is really good with institutions when they decide to have institutions. They might be bureaucratic and so on, but if Europe decides to set a supertanker in a certain direction, you'll set it in that direction and there'll be no deviation. J.D. Vance's speech, and of course all the subsequent talk about Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, telling everyone you're pretty much on your own. I think that was the wake-up call that Europe needed. I think we're seeing it as we speak. $200 billion being allocated by the German chancellor for defense, going from 2% to 2.5% here in the UK and going up to 3% by 2030. I'm sure you're going to see it in every different country. They're going to do that. And it may be that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump regret what they've done, because when Europe has a powerful military and a cohesive approach towards this stuff, Europe becomes a much less pliant counterparty.
Well, I hope you're right. It is always darkest before the dawn, and maybe the disorderers have done so much disordering so chaotically that they will wake the orderers to solve their coordination complexities and actually get their act together. Bill, is there anything that you'd like to conclude with, a message to the mega orderers?
I guess we should all just pray for Ukraine, because that at the end of the day, they're not just fighting for themselves, they're fighting for all of us.
It's very inspiring to hear from Bill Browder. He concluded this episode with practical suggestions. In other words, the confiscation of Russian assets, using them to defend Ukraine. But then with a spiritual component, the need for a prayer. And I think in these uncertain and disordered times, it would really help us to hear a prayer from Kyiv. So we turn to my close friend, Natalia Tsuprik, one of Ukraine's most accomplished musical composers, who's in Kyiv now, and she sends us this audio prayer.
We don't want war. We have lost too many people. to agree to something that will lead to another invasion in the future. Unfortunately, in the past 3 years, I suspect that the West might have not understood what Ukraine is and what kind of people we are. During the Euromaidan revolution in 2013-14, the police shot at us with real bullets, and we fought them with wooden sticks, and we somehow won. In 2022, against all odds, we went to fight the second biggest army in the world with almost nothing, and 3 years later, here we are, still standing. It's very simple. If Russia stops, the war ends. If Ukraine stops, Ukraine ends. So we have no choice. We must fight until the very end, until we can somehow win. We just hope that the West will be on the right side of history in this together with us, because we're fighting for something bigger than just us. And we're really, really grateful to all those who support us.
Mega orderers, if you've enjoyed hearing Bill Browder today, I have exciting news, which is that Bill Browder, myself, and former Disorder guest Stephanie Baker, who is an expert on sanctions against Russia, are trying to have an event at the Frontline Club at 7 p.m. on March 21. It's a Friday. It isn't fully confirmed, but we're going to have a discount for the mega orderers out there if it happens. Ergo, please join the Substack, and we will be putting the information there for this really interesting event about what Europe can do to confront Russia, given Trump's betrayal of Ukraine. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the mega orderer who wants to seize all the Russian assets, George McDonough. And our executive producer is Neil Fern. We are wishing you an orderly week, and we hope that you can help us. Write to your MP. Ask for Russian assets to be seized. Write on Facebook and Twitter saying that you support Ukraine, because popular opinion actually matters in this war of ideas. So those are my thoughts, and I am wishing you an orderly week.
Hi there, I'm Al Murray, co-host of We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the world's premier Second World War history podcast from Goalhanger.
And I'm James Holland, best-selling World War II historian, and together we tell the best stories from the war. This time, we're doing a deep dive into the last major attack by the Nazis on the West, the Battle of the Bulge.
And what's so fascinating about this story is we've been able to show how quite a lot of the popular history about this battle is kind of the wrong way round, isn't it, Jim? The whole thing is a disaster from the start. Even Hitler's plans for the attack are insane and divorced from reality.
Well, you're so right, but what we can do is celebrate this as an American success story for the ages. From their generals at the top to the GIs on the front line, full of gumption and grit, the Bulge should be remembered as a great victory for the USA.
And if this sounds good to you, we've got a short taste for you here. Search We Have Ways wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks.
Anyway, so who is Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper?
But I see his jaunty hat and I just think...
and his SS skull and crossbones.
Well, and I see his reputation and I think, you know, you might be a handsome devil, but the emphasis is on the devil bit rather than the handsome.
Anyway, be that as may, he's 29 years old, and he's got a very interesting career, really, because he comes from a pretty right-wing family. Let's face it. He's joined the SS at a pretty early stage. He's very into National Socialism. He's also been Himmler's adjutant.
Yeah,
he took a little bit of time off in the summer of 1940 to go and fight with the first Waffen-SS Panzer Division.
Yeah.
Did pretty well. Went back to being Himmler's adjutant. Then went off and commanded troops in the Eastern Front. Rose up to be a pretty young regimental commander. I mean, there's not many people that age are an Obersturmbannführer, which is sort of colonel.
Yes, you see, what must it have been like if Himmler's adjutant turns up and he's been posted to you as an officer? Do you think, well, he only got that job because of his connections? For Peiper, it must have been he's always having to prove himself, surely, because he has turned up. He's not worked his way through the ranks of the Waffen-SS. He's dolloped in having come from head office, as it were. It must be a peculiar position to be in, right?
Yeah.
He's got lots to prove, right? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and he's from a sort of middle class background as well.
Yeah.
But he's got an older brother who's had mental illness and attempted suicide and never really recovers, and actually has died of TB eventually in 1942.
Gosh.
He's got a younger brother called Horst, who's also joined the SS and taken Kopfverbande and died in a never really properly explained accident in Poland in 1941.
Right.
Piper gains a sort of growing reputation on the Eastern Front for being kind of very inspiring, fearless, obviously courageous, all the guys love him, all that kind of stuff. But he's also orders the destruction of the entire village of Krasnaya Polyana in a kind of revenge killing by Russian partisans.
Yeah.
And his unit becomes known as the Blowtorch Battalion because of his penchant for torching Russian villages. So he's got all the gongs. He's got Iron Cross, Second Class, First Class, Cross of Gold, Knight's Cross. Did very well at Kursk. Briefly in northern Italy, actually. Then in Ukraine. Then in Normandy, he suffers a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
And he's relieved of his command on the 2nd of August. And he's hospitalised from September to October. So he's not in command during Operation Lutich. And then he rejoins 1st SS Panzer Regiment as its commander again in October 1944. It's really, really odd. I mean...
But isn't that interesting, though? Because if you're a Lancer, if you're an ordinary soldier, you're not allowed to have a nervous breakdown. You don't get hospitalised. You don't get time off. How you could interpret this is a sort of Nazi princeling, isn't he? Himmler's adjutant. He's demonstrated the necessary Nazi zeal on the Eastern Front and all this sort of stuff. It comes to Normandy where they're losing. Why else would he have a nervous breakdown? He's shown all the zeal and application in the Nazi manner up to this point, and they're losing, and because he's a knob, because he's well connected, he gets to be hospitalized if he has a nervous breakdown. He isn't told, like an ordinary German soldier, there's no such thing as combat fatigue, mate, go back to work.
Yes, and it's a nervous breakdown, not combat fatigue.
Well, yes, of course.
But
what's the
one
difference?
SS soldier said of him, Piper was the most dynamic man I ever met. He just got things done.
Yeah.
You get this image I have of him of having this kind of sort of slightly manic energy.
Yeah.
He's virulently National Socialist. He's got this great reputation. He's damned if anyone's going to tarnish it. He's a driver, all those things.
He's trying to make the will triumph, isn't he? He's working towards the Führer. He's imbued with, he knows what's expected of him, extreme violence and cruelty and pushing his men on. I mean, he's the Führer principle writ large, isn't he, as an SS officer? Which is why cruelty and extreme violence are bundled in to wherever he goes, basically.